our Conversations with Great Minds with Dr. Mary L. Trump, who has recently launched a new newsletter at marytrump.substack.com. You can tweet her at Mary L. Trump, and is the author most specifically relevant to this conversation today with a new book, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. Mary, by coincidence, during the break for the maybe third to a half of our audience that are listening on nonprofit radio stations, during the break, the book report that we ran while our commercial stations were doing news was from John Dean and Robert Altmaier, their book, The Authoritarians, and John Dean's book, Conservatives Without Conscience, is based on that as well. I'm sure as a psychologist you're familiar with this whole idea of authoritarian personalities, and that arguably, according to Altmaier anyway, 20% roughly of any population, any national population, have authoritarian tendencies. Most are authoritarian followers. Occasionally you get authoritarian leaders. I'm curious your thoughts on that, and B, how does that inform our politics and the role in our politics that your uncle has played and that the Republican Party has been playing over arguably the last 40 years, as you know, starting with Nixon's law and order thing, as they've been taking more and more and more progressively more authoritarian positions, particularly with regard to people of color. Oops, did I not put Mary back on the air? I'm sorry, Mary. You're back on the air. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I heard everything you said, though,
Great.
So we're good.
Okay, thank you.
It's entirely correct that approximately 20% of any population has authoritarian personality or authoritarian leanings, and as you said, that does not mean that you want to become an authoritarian leader. It means that you're more comfortable being a follower, you prefer the status quo, change scares you, you like homogeneity. But it's not a political. It doesn't mean you're more reactionary than anything else. So what I think has happened, though, is that the Republicans have gotten quite good at co-opting such people, and the Democrats haven't figured out how to. Now, for example, one of the most diabolical things Donald did was divide us during COVID at a time we most needed to be united. Now, authoritarian personalities like to be the us in an us versus them scenario. A kind, empathetic, smart leader would have been able to bring those people into the camp, so to speak, by saying it's us, America, against this deadly virus. Donald, on the other hand, because he needs division, he thrives on division, made it us, MAGA, Donald supporters, the Make America Great Again crowd, against people of color, people in blue states, Democrats. So, it's not at all just because 20% of the population is authoritarian. They're not hopelessly entrenched in right-wing politics. We just need to figure out how to talk to them more effectively.
What would be your suggestion to Democrats about how to talk to those Americans, that 20% of Americans who really just want, strong daddy or mommy in charge?
Yeah, that's a lot harder to do now because one, the Donald made it so clear that the only way for them to be considered viable was to support him wholeheartedly. We have Fox News spreading his propaganda, spreading their own propaganda. We have the situation in which they're responding more to conspiracy theories, no matter how insane, other than rational thought. So it's not a quick fix. I think the first, most obvious thing Democrats need to do is make the American people's lives better, and they need to act like they're in charge because they are. But the clock is ticking. Time is running out. You were talking earlier about the incredible statistics the data regarding what a small minority has veto power over the rest of us. America is not a democracy. That's one of the reasons why. The Electoral College is another, and the filibuster is the one that you were referring to. I mean, the Democrats, if they want to make sure, one, that the American people's lives are better, and two, that America remains, or at least continues to have the potential to become a democracy, they need to do the most basic thing and get rid of the filibuster, and then we'll see what happens. But, until such time as they do that, I'm deeply afraid that we will never get to the point where we can start to educate people in a way that is helpful to them.
And I think it would be important for Democrats to realize that the authoritarians loved Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, he came out here. This is on the 360, Sean, if you can fire it up. This is FDR. I mean, responding to attacks from Republicans, right?
Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
And that speaks to those authoritarians, followers who are not fascists. They just want some strong character in Washington, D.C. to make the country better. And why can't Democrats learn that lesson now?
I don't know. And it is so effective. And honestly, I think a lot of people would find it a refreshing alternative to the politics of white grievance and whining that goes on, that certainly Donald perfected. So I do not know, but they need to figure it out really quickly, because what we need now is strength, unity, and effective messaging.
Yeah. Let's talk about race for a moment. You talk about this a lot in your book. The issue of race is threaded throughout your new book, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. Of course, that's one of the largest and deepest scars in our national psyche throughout history. Let me back up a little bit. There was a study that was published a couple of years ago that really got my attention. I'm guessing you probably saw it, where they had taken white rats and black rats, just lab rats that have been bred to have white fur or black fur. And they created this plastic tube. It was about 8 inches long and about 3 inches in diameter that had a door that could easily be opened from the outside but not from the inside. And so it was like a trap that could be opened from the outside by a rat. They put a black rat in that and put that clear plastic tube in a cage with a bunch of white rats, and the white rats didn't try to rescue the black rat as much as he tried to get out. They reversed it, with black, reversed the race, as it were, of the rats. Same deal. Then they took, in the next generation of rats, when the next litters of rats were born, they took half the black pups from the black mother and had the white mother nurse them, and took half the white pups from the white mother and had the black mother nurse them. And then, so all these black and white rats grew up together, literally. Mm-hmm. And then they repeated the experiment, and this time, regardless of what color the fur of the rat was, the rats tried to help the rat of the same, help the rat escape. Whereas before, they had only helped the rats of the same colored fur escape. And they had they'd seen this differentiation. Do you see a parallel between that study and how we're dealing with this in the United States? I mean, we tried this with busing back in the 70s. Let's just push people together. I think it actually did some good, but now our schools are more segregated than they were in 1968. What do we do about this?
Yeah, well, yes, it's a fascinating study, and the one takeaway is that, wow, race is a construct even for lab rats.
That's right.
Right. So I don't know that we've ever tried hard enough, because yes, busing was a potentially effective way, but remember, it was all a one-way street. Only black children were bused to white schools. White children were not bused to black schools, because black schools, because of the system, were inferior because they weren't funded properly. I mean, entirely for reasons having to do at the governmental level.
Well, it's why we pay for schools with property taxes. I mean, that goes back to the 1890s, and the whole point was keep the poor neighborhoods with crappy schools.
That's right, and we will never have equity and adequacy in this country if that continues. It's despicable. I've always found it despicable. Don't understand it at all. But that's the way it is right now, and we also need to understand, as you do, that segregation of neighborhoods and schools isn't de facto, it's de jure. And right
Under
now,
law.
that's the case. Right. It's at the government, local, state, and federal level, neighborhoods and schools are segregated intentionally. And now the reason they're more segregated than ever is largely because of Chief Justice John Roberts.
Right.
So I personally think that one of the best ways to start to deal with this, and this is a decades, generations long project, is for us to start recognizing, at the very least, how we got here and how white supremacy and white privilege continue to be, I think, are this country's biggest problems.
I'm looking at, there's this newsletter called The Writing, RIGHTING, and their subtitle is Alerting Liberal Audiences to Today's Headlines from the Right. You know, like we read the right-wing stuff so you don't have to. Here are some of the headlines from the last 24 hours from major right-wing sites like WorldNet Daily and the Washington Free Beacon and Big League Politics and the Federalist and the Daily Caller and the National Review. 5 dead in Waukesha thanks to the left. Now it turns out the Waukesha driver was a black guy. So number 2, the Waukesha slaughter and the plague of black racism. Meet the progressive DA behind the Waukesha bail catastrophe. The persecution of Kyle Rittenhouse. Tucker Carlson's fascinating interview with Rittenhouse. Censoring the Pilgrims. The nation's top scientists lied about COVID and got away with it. I mean, it's this continual drumbeat of either racism or embracing Trumpism that seems to me to be disconnected from reality. But they're living in a bubble that is whole to them. How do you penetrate that?
Yeah, I just want to add that it doesn't help that papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times continue to pile on to Democrats, and the fact that there's no corollary on the left to counter this kind of insanity. Well, I kind of feel about that the way I feel about people who voted for Donald the second time around. I don't want to waste my time on them. I know that's not a great answer, but there's nothing. I don't think there's anything we can do right now to change the minds of people who are susceptible to that. They've been so convinced over time that being white is not only the most important thing about them, but it's kind of the only thing they have, because they keep voting for people who, won't give them child care or health care or job security or unions, as you mentioned earlier. The best way to think about it is I think about the Pizzagate scandal. People were more willing to believe that Hillary Clinton was running a child pedophilia ring in a basement in a pizza place that didn't have a basement than they were to believe that was nonsense. So, again, I think at this point it's simply policy. We have to make people's lives better and convince them, or remind them, I should say, that not only is government a force for good, or can be in the right hands for good, but that the government is us. It's not some alien entity that's out to get us. It's us. And they've been convinced that that's not the case. Keep your government's hands off of my Social Security.
Right.
Think about the ignorance that's necessary. The longer term solution is, of course, education. We need to teach civics in a way that's meaningful from the time kids are in elementary school. We need to teach critical thinking And as is becoming more and more important, we need to teach media literacy too.
Yeah, they're doing that in Finland. Did you catch that story a couple of months ago?
Oh, I didn't. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. Mary, your book is titled The Reckoning, and the subtitle, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. Let me, in the last 5 minutes or so that we have here, let me just toss this to you. What is our nation's trauma, and how do we find ways to heal? What is the reckoning?
Our nation's trauma, the original traumas, were the genocide committed against the native population by white people, and the enslavement and genocide of the African population we kidnapped from their homelands. And the reason the impact of those things continue to be operative in American society is because not only have we never atoned for them, we barely acknowledge them. So white supremacy has continued to be an enormously influential belief system in American society, white society in particular. And it's also now a major platform in one of our two major political parties. As you said, there aren't dog whistles anymore. It's just blatant. You need to prove your racist bona fides in order to be a Republican. And the other reason I think that the traumas have been perpetuated over time and that people have become more and more susceptible to accepting criminality and anti-constitutional behavior in their leaders is because America has never held powerful white men accountable for anything, starting with Robert E. Lee, who, by the way, not only was a general for the Confederacy and a traitor to his country, but he owned and tortured human beings, was never punished sufficiently. He became president of Washington University after the Civil War, which was renamed in his honor posthumously, and then Gerald Ford pardoned him in 1974. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. If Robert E. Lee can't be held accountable, do we really expect Donald Trump to be? And if he's not, then there is literally no limit to what people like him or in his party will try to get away with. So how do we heal? We heal by just as an individual who's been traumatized heals. You face the truth about your trauma. You recognize it. You have to get to the point where even though, I'm not responsible for slavery. You're not responsible for slavery. But we have to recognize the ways in which we have benefited from a system that continues to preference white privilege. Because if we don't, the problems continue. So we need to look in the face and say, okay, I'm part of the problem. What can I do to change it? We need to do that as individuals. We need to do that as a country. And we need to do it as soon as humanly possible. And we need to stop pretending that it's in the past. As Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative said, slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved.
Yeah, well, it's actually still legal in the United States according to the 13th Amendment. You just have to do it under color of law. Somebody who's been convicted of a crime can still be held in slavery and frankly are all across the United States.
Absolutely.
It's an absolutely extraordinary. The book is brilliant. It's called The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. The author is Mary Trump, and New York Times bestselling author. Check out her newsletter at marytrump.substack.com and free subscriptions there, too. And also you can tweet her at Mary L. Trump. Mary, thanks so much for dropping by. It's great talking with you again.
Thom, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
My pleasure, too.